Hello, I'm Chipper Wichman, the President and CEO of the National Tropical Botanical Garden. In a few minutes, you're going to hear from Tom Friedman of the New York Times, speaking on extinction or sustainability. One of the most crucial topics we face today on our planet, sustainability. It's a personal issue that each of us need to think about how we live and how we consume. For today, with over 7 billion people on our planet, we're exceeding the carrying capacity of our Earth. And the future generations will depend upon our ability to learn how to rein in our consumerism and live within the means of our environment. Well, the garden is very involved in scientific research. We explore throughout the Pacific. In fact, we're the leader of biodiversity assessment throughout the Pacific. We work on some of the most remote islands in the world. And islands, especially Pacific islands, because of their remoteness, are evolutionary engines. So our botanists go out and discover, name, and classify plants from throughout the Pacific region. That's a critical part of what we do. That's discovery and scientific research. Then we conserve them. We protect these species. We bring them back and protect them through ex situ conservation, growing them in our botanical gardens, conserving their seeds in our seed banks, and protecting them through our micropropagation labs. We then educate people about them. Ultimately, education is probably the most important thing we do, because we need to educate the public and build public will for the programs that will preserve plants in perpetuity. It's really exciting work.
My role right now is to introduce our speaker tonight, Tom Friedman. And this is quite the no-brainer, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of speakers introduce people by saying they need no introduction. But you already know about the fact that Tom has 16 honorary degrees, 3 Pulitzer Prizes, at least 2 Overseas Press Awards, the Overseas Press Award for Lifetime Achievement, and 1 National Book Award. And I think, Tom, we can probably call you Sir, because I think the British government has done something in that area. But there is one area of passion of Tom that very few of you do know about, and this is what I would like to discuss for about another 30 seconds. Tom grew up, his first early aspiration was to become a professional golfer. I'm not kidding you. And he captained his high school golf team. And he caddied for Chichi Rodriguez in the U.S. Open. Did any of you know all that? Did you know that he wrote the foreword for a photo book, a golf-oriented photo book called Classic Shots, published by National Geographic? And did you know what is the last line on his official biography? You know, the last line is called Lasting Impressions. What does he want to leave you with? And the last line of his official biography is simply stated, his golf handicap is a 5.9 index. So it's my pleasure to welcome Tom. Thank you for coming here. And I've been told that he loves answering questions after his talks.
Merrill, thank you, and Cindy, thank you for inspiring this. They walked up to me on a putting green and said, we need you at this event. It's the 50th anniversary. It's a great organization, and I'm glad to be here. It's a real treat. My wife Ann is here with me. As I was preparing for this talk, I went to the NTBG website to read up on your mission, and I found the following. Said that the mission of the National Tropical Botanical Garden is to enrich life through discovery, scientific research, conservation, and education by perpetuating the survival of plants, ecosystems, and cultural knowledge of tropical regions. That's a wonderful mission. As all of you know, though, I am not a botanist or a scientist, and you've had a day-long seminar from some of the most knowledgeable such scholars in your field. I'm actually a foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times. So what am I doing here? Well, I've actually had a long interest in environmentalism, going back to when I served in Beirut in the late 1970s, when I wrote my first environmental story of sorts about Lebanese militiamen who used machine guns to fire at migrating storks and raptors as they flew from Europe to Africa across the Lebanese land bridge. Remember that, honey? Yeah. for their winter migration. Since then, I've learned a ton, though, about nature. And I even wrote a book on the subject, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. But I would never be so foolish as to speak to such an expert audience about nature. That's your specialty. What I want to do tonight instead is speak to you about what I've learned from nature. On that, I'm something of an expert. You see, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, that sounds really contrived. What could nature possibly teach a New York Times columnist about foreign policy, or politics, or geopolitics? Well, actually, quite a lot. You see, I'm a huge believer in the idea that creativity comes when you have two or more different areas of expertise, and you blend one with the other. You mash them together to get a third new perspective. And for me, that's often involved blending an understanding and appreciation of the natural world and the worlds of politics, geopolitics, and economics. And what I would like to do tonight is share with you a few examples of what I mean, of how you can actually better illuminate both the natural world and the worlds of politics, geopolitics, and economics by blending them together. I can think of no better place to start than with the 2008 subprime crisis. I believe 2008 was our warning heart attack from both the market and Mother Nature. They both got together and told us, you cannot keep growing the way you're growing economically or environmentally. How are we growing? Well, in brief, we were borrowing more and more money from China to build more and more houses and buy more and more stuff made in more and more Chinese factories powered by more and more coal that earned China more and more dollars so it could lend them back to us so we could buy more and more stuff and build more and more homes and borrow more and more money from China so its factories could run on more and more coal. I could do this all night, but I won't. The bottom line, though, is that we were growing in an unsustainable way in both the market and Mother Nature at the same time. Because in both realms, we were actually practicing the exact same accounting. And what was that? In both the market and Mother Nature, we were underpricing risk, privatizing the gains, and socializing the losses. In the market, we allowed people to massively underprice the risk of subprime mortgages. We allowed the people who did that to privatize their gains. And then when they all blew up, we socialized the losses across the whole economy. We did the exact same thing in nature. We allowed people to massively underprice the risk of carbon emissions. We allowed those who did it to privatize their gains from cheap oil or coal, and we socialized the losses by spreading out all that carbon across the whole global environment to be paid by coming generations, and in the process, raise the carbon content of our atmosphere from 280 parts per million to over 400 parts per million today, about 100 times faster than at the end of the last ice age. And because we were practicing the exact same accounting in the market and Mother Nature, it is no accident at all, that in 2008, Citibank, Iceland's banks, and the biggest ice bank in Antarctica all started melting at the same time. And it was no accident at all, that Bear Stearns and the polar bear both faced extinction at the same time. Just as Citibankers and Icelandic bankers got to engage in wild speculative financial practices that did not reflect the real costs and the real risks of massive defaults or losses, so the same was going on in nature. But this was not just a breakdown in accounting. There was also a breakdown in values in both the market and Mother Nature. The whole credit bubble was built on the twin principles of IBG and YBG. I'll be gone, or you'll be gone when things go bad. The mortgage broker who first sold the mortgage and then passed it off to a bigger financial institution like Fannie Mae or Citibank knew that he would be long gone if and when the buyer defaulted. Or he told the buyer that you'll be gone if there's a problem because the housing market would always go up. So if you cannot make the payments, then just flip the house for more than you paid for it and you'll be bailed out. The rating agencies whose fees and incomes depended on how many of these bonds they got to rate had great incentive to give them high ratings so they would sell more easily, and therefore more investment houses and banks who wanted them would use their rating services. And if those bonds blew up, well, said the raters, IBG, I'll be gone. And the investment banks had a great incentive to just turn out more and more bundles of these mortgages and sell them around the world. No problem, IBG, I'll be gone. We're doing the exact same thing in nature, IBG and YBG, which is why the World Wildlife Fund in 2008, its Living Planet report concluded that we are already operating 25% above the planet's biological capacity to support life on Earth. No problem, I'll be gone. But World Wildlife International Director James Leap put it this way at the time: the world is currently struggling with the consequences of overvaluing its financial assets, but a more fundamental crisis looms ahead, an ecological credit crunch caused by undervaluing the environmental assets that are the basis of all life and prosperity. Most of us are propping up our current lifestyles and our economic growth by drawing and increasingly overdrawing on the ecological capital of other parts of the world. No problem, you'll be gone. But this is faulty accounting. An IBG and YBG way of thinking were propelled by a still deeper problem, a deeper value shift from sustainable values to situational values as we moved in America from the greatest generation to the baby boomer generation. You see, when it comes down to it, there are really only two kinds of values, argues my friend, the business philosopher Dov Seidman, and those are situational values and sustainable values. Situational relationships are all about the here and now. What I can get out of here and now, right now. They're all about exploiting the short term. It's all about Nike, just do it. Practicing sustainable values means that you behave in a way that literally sustains the natural world around you, sustains the tropical forest, sustains business relationships, sustains personal relationships, sustains your community and your country and the planet for generations to come. And that automatically leads you to the values of openness, honesty, and mutual accountability, and always thinking about the impact your actions will have over the long term, always thinking in terms of legacy and contributing as much, if not more, than you take. As in nature, so in markets, we need to bring sustainable values back to the center, not situational ones. So that's the parallel between the 2008 crisis and what's been going on in the natural world. And I see a similar parallel in studying globalization. Nature can also teach you a lot about globalization. Something really big has happened since I wrote The World is Flat a decade ago. The world has actually gone from connected to hyper-connected and from interconnected to interdependent. These are differences in degree that are huge differences in kind. There's no better way to understand this degree of global interdependency today than comparing it to an ecosystem, where, as John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, once famously noted, everything in the universe is hitched. How so? Well, in May 2010, I visited Athens, Greece, at the height of the debt crisis, and I began my column there this way. By the time I got there last Sunday, the fire at the Marfin Ignatia Bank on Stadu Street had been extinguished in Athens, but the charcoal smell of the torched bank interior still wafted out onto the sidewalk through the broken windows. Ever since Greek anarchists firebombed the bank on May 5, killing 3 employees who had defied a general strike, the Marfin Bank has become an impromptu shrine. A huge pile of bouquets, teddy bears, and scribbled condolence notes grew by the hour on the sidewalk out front as Athenians kept on coming to pay their respects to the innocents killed inside. People would lay down a rose and then just stare at the building or read the handwritten messages pasted above the facade. My own eye went to a colorful drawing, clearly done by a child, of a burning building and people screaming help from upper windows. Under it was written in Greek, "In what kind of world will I grow up? Lydia, age 10. A good question, Lydia. The Marfin Bank was ground zero for the global meltdown that occurred 10 days earlier. As soon as TV footage of the bank employees trapped in the blaze hit the news channels, it sparked fears that Greece would default on its massive debts held by other European banks. That triggered a steep decline in the euro and shares of European banks. That plunge was then exacerbated by news of an inconclusive British election, and finally all of it together helped fuel a 1,000-point drop in the Dow on Wall Street. And that is where I would start to answer Lydia. Lydia, dear, you're growing up in an increasingly integrated world where we will all need to be guided by the simple credo of the nature preservation group Conservation International, and that is, lost there, felt here. Conservation International coined that phrase to remind us that our natural world and climate constitute not only an interconnected system, but an interdependent system, just like globalization has become today. When species, forests, and ocean life are deprived in one region, their loss will eventually be felt in another. Tropical forests represent some 5% of the Earth's surface, but they harbor 50% of all living species. That is why Conservation International coined that phrase. What is lost there is felt here. If we lose what is left of the Amazon, we'll all feel the climate effects, changing rainfall, loss of biodiversity, and all the other things that enrich our world. And what is true for Mother Nature is true for markets and societies in a hyper-connected world. When Greeks binge and rack up billions of euros of debt, Germans have to dig into their mattresses and bail out Greeks, while Americans brace themselves for losses from all their bank holdings in Greek bonds. Everyone is connected, and no one's in charge. So whether it's in bank vaults of Athens or the rainforests of Brazil, what's lost in Athens today will be felt in Brazil, and what's lost in Brazil today will be felt in Athens. It's all the same globalization, one financial, the other about biodiversity. Another interesting parallel I've come across is that between carbon debt and financial debt. John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor, likes to use the image of a cliff and a fog when discussing how we should respond to climate change. We don't know exactly where we fall off the ledge, where that edge is, when we emit just one molecule too many of carbon and enter into a nonlinear descent into the unknown. We don't know where that cliff is, but it's out there somewhere. We're driving toward that cliff in a fog, says John Holdren about the climate, and that's always a good time to start tapping on the brakes. The same is true with our national debt. We don't know exactly where we fall off the ledge, where we spend $1 of borrowed money too many and enter into a nonlinear descent into the financial abyss. But we know there's a cliff out there, and now is a good time to start tapping on the brakes. We should be both emitting less carbon to bend the emissions curve down and racking up less debt to bend our debt to GDP curve down. Unfortunately, we're still doing neither. Indeed, we're actually taunting the two most powerful and merciless forces on the planet, the market and Mother Nature, at the same time. We're essentially saying to both of them, hey, what you got, baby? No interest, just that little interest rate rise? That's all you got? Just that little bitty temperature increase? That's all you got? I just hope we get our act together before the market and Mother Nature each show us what they've got. Let's look at the huge carbon and financial deficits we're amassing. For thousands of years, up to the dawn of the industrial age, 200 years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained 280 parts per million of heat-trapping greenhouse gas carbon dioxide. Today, that number is over 400 ppm, as I said earlier, on its way to 450. And with that, we will reach a tipping point where we can create out of control climate change acceleration. We're on a similar trajectory with our debt. Mounting deficits have driven America's debt to GDP ratio from 36% in 2007 to 74% today in just basically 7 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, that's higher percentage than at any point in U.S. history except a brief period around World War II. At some point, when we allow so much carbon to build up in the atmosphere, our mightiest efforts to cut emissions through energy efficiency, conservation, and new technologies will only enable us to stay in place. They won't be able to bend the curve down anymore. At 450 ppm, it's not a place we want to get stuck. And at some point, the debt will get so large that big tax increases and spending cuts will simply go to pay the interest. We also won't be able to bend that curve anymore, and spending on infrastructure, education, and the poor will vanish. All our efforts will just be to stay in place. Yet I'm struck by how many liberals insist on reducing carbon emissions immediately, but on the deficit say there's no urgency because there are no interest rate rises in sight. And I'm struck at how many conservatives insist we must reduce the deficit immediately, but on climate say there's no urgency because so far no temperature rise is in sight. One reason interest rates are so low is that they're being suppressed by the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing. That won't last. And one reason that temperatures have not risen more is because the oceans have been absorbing more of the heat than scientists predicted. But neither will last. In the market, no one should feel good that America is just the cleanest dirty shirt. And in climate, no one should have any illusions. Mother Nature doesn't do quantitative easing, says Hal Harvey, my environmentalist friend. That's why we should be tapping on the brakes in both the market and Mother Nature at the same time. Now let's go overseas a little. You've read a lot about ISIS. This too has a huge environmental analogy. On September 12, 2014, Ramzi Mardini, a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Middle East Center, published an essay that used the natural world to illuminate how we need not fear the spread of ISIS beyond the areas it's already occupied in Syria and Iraq. The borders of ISIS's territory, he wrote, have more or less reached their outer potential. It's no coincidence that the militants' gains have been limited to areas populated by disenfranchised Sunnis eager for protection from Shiite forces. It would require far greater power to hold territory populated by a sect that didn't support their presence. The group's rapid growth, he wrote, has occurred in its most compatible regions as a species proliferates within its natural habitat. Established insurgencies and weak or non-existent state institutions there, but that's as far as it can go. Hence, its support in Iraq is not the rule, it's the exception. The combination of these conditions does not exist in much of the greater Middle East. It has reached the limit of its natural habitat. Yes, ISIS illustrates both the concept of natural habitats and invasive species. An invasive species emerges and is able to outcompete the native species, often because something has changed in the climate that weakens the resistance of the existing natural vegetation and animal life, creating a new receptive niche for an invasive species. When you take a natural system and plow it up and drain it, it loses its natural resistance. That is basically what the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and the Iraqi government of Nouri al-Maliki did to the Sunni areas of their respective countries. They starved them of money and bombed them mercilessly from the air, destroying any natural resistance Sunnis there had to a barbarous jihadist cult called ISIS. Yes, ISIS is an invasive species, which heretofore could never have taken root in that Iraqi and Syrian soil, but were able to only after Sunnis there were abused by these Shiite regimes. I find nature and invasive species very helpful in highlighting that trend. But that raises another very important trend ISIS does in my mind, and it's about topsoil. The rise of this barbaric cult called ISIS offers us another parallel with nature. My friend, the environmentalist Hal Harvey, taught me this. The thing that sustains any ecosystem is topsoil. And the first thing you learn about topsoil is that in most places, it is really thin. It is just this sliver of black dirt coating the earth, covering 1,000 miles below of lifeless, inhospitable rock. And yet the ecosystem that emerges from just that thin sliver of topsoil is so rich, so plentiful, it's able to sustain such a huge diversity of plant and animal life. But never forget that this thin skin that sustains our natural world is just that, so thin, and it can easily get washed or blown away. And so it is with the political world. You see groups emerging in Iraq and Syria today, chopping off heads, using power drills on captives, raping women, plundering whole societies, and it reminds you that the topsoil of civilization is very, very thin. This ethical and cultural soil that all our economic and political institutions rest upon, our political and economic ecosystems, is really very brittle and can so easily be eroded away. That's what ISIS teaches you. We've had glimpses of that in our own country, looting that happened in New York City after a blackout, or when rioting occurs in some inner city, or when the iron fist of a dictator in Yugoslavia is loosened, or in Rwanda, or in Iraq. So both in the natural world, we must preserve and cherish this topsoil. In nature, it's called dirt, and in politics, it's called shared values and the rule of law. But in both, it is the thin layer that separates civilization from chaos and life from death. As my friend Wes Jackson, the founder of the Land Institute, likes to say, in politics and nature, we need to stop treating soil like dirt. Polycultures and monocultures. Also, a huge analogy I find with the political world. I've spent most of my career covering Middle East politics. I always thought it was its own unique field, but recently I've come to see its connection with nature as well. I learned that from the bioscientist Wes Jackson, the president of the Land Institute. I was out visiting his experimental farm in Salina, Kansas, where he's trying to develop a perennial variety of wheat. Wes explained to me that the prairie was a diverse wilderness with a complex ecosystem that naturally supported all kinds of wildlife, not to mention American Indians, until the Europeans arrived, plowed it up, and covered it with single species crops, monocultures, mostly wheat, corn, or soybeans. Annual monocultures are much more susceptible to disease and require much more fossil fuel energy, plows, fertilizer, pesticides, to maintain. They also exhaust the topsoil, so vital for life. Polycultures, by contrast, provide species diversity, which provides chemical diversity, which provides much more natural resistance and can substitute for the fossil fuels and chemicals that we have not evolved with. That is why during the Dust Bowl years, Jackson noted, the monoculture crops all died, but the polyculture prairie with its diverse ecosystem survived. And that brings us back to the Middle East. Al-Qaeda often says that if the Muslim world wants to restore its strength, it needs to go back to the pure days of Islam, when it was a monoculture, unsullied by Western influences. In fact, though, the golden age of the Arab Muslim world was when it became the world's greatest polyculture. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, during this period, notes Wikipedia, the Arab world became an intellectual center for science, philosophy, medicine, and education. It was a collection of cultures which put together, synthesized, and significantly advanced the knowledge gained from ancient Rome, Chinese, Indian, Persian, Egyptian, and Greek sources. Unfortunately, what's going on in the Middle East today is that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, funded indirectly by fossil fuels from the Persian Gulf, are trying to purge Iraq and Syria of any religious ethnic diversity. They are trying to plow up its polycultures, all the polycultures of the region. Think of Baghdad or Alexandria, once great melting pots of Greeks, Italians, Jews, Christians, Kurds, Turkmen, Arabs, and Muslims, and turn them into monocultures. It makes these societies much less able to spark new ideas. To put it another way, diversity and tolerance were once native plants in the Middle East, the way the polyculture prairie was in the Middle West. And it gave that region enormous resilience and energy. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, using high-density fossil fuels, are trying to wipe out all that diversity and create a monoculture that's enormously susceptible to conspiracy theories and diseased ideas, as much as any monoculture in nature is. What can the environmentalists teach the Islamists today? Oh, a huge amount. I went to Egypt and Syria last year to look at how environmental stresses contributed to the Arab awakening as part of a documentary for Showtime called Years of Living Dangerously. In Egypt, I traveled to Marsa Alam on the Red Sea with Ahmed Al-Drubi, a campaigner for Greenpeace in Egypt, and Amr Ali, the head of the Hurghada Environmental Protection and Conservation Association called HEPIA, a Red Sea conservation group that looked at how overbuilding, overfishing, and rising water temperatures had led to the bleaching of some of the Red Sea's most spectacular coral reefs. As we set out for a dive to look at these reefs, Drubi tried to explain Egypt's central problem to me using the example of Cairo's jammed traffic, among the worst in the world. The other day, Drubi said, I was standing on a main intersection in downtown Cairo where two one-way streets meet. As I stood there, I saw cars going both ways down both one-way streets. Cars were coming and going in 4 different directions, and other cars were double parked. I was standing next to a shop owner watching this. This is a complete mess, said the shop owner. No one has any civic responsibility. They each only care about themselves, getting to where they're going. A few minutes later, Drubi told me, a car that was parked right in front of the man's shop drove away, and a new car tried to slip in. This same owner came out with a chair, put it in the middle of the parking space, and told the new driver not to block his store, but to double park and block part of the street instead. Drubi told me, so the shop owner saw the problem. He knew the reasons for the problem. He knew the solution, but he wouldn't do his part because he thought others would not do theirs. The net result was that the traffic was worse for everyone. We have to break this cycle to show people that if they act in common, in the common good, they will benefit each other. What happened on Cairo's roads happened along the Red Sea coast to its environment. Each hotel owner looked out for himself, while a corrupt government looked the other way. Some hotel owners, to expand their land or gain some beach, simply put landfill over the coral reefs on their shores. Marine activities were unregulated, stressing dolphins in their own resting areas where they try to sleep safe from the sharks. Fishermen overfished, especially for the sharks, which they sold for meat and for fins. And they used dynamite and mesh nets that killed the multicolored reef fish, along with the grouper they were trying to catch. As a result, the whole reef ecosystem became less resilient to global warming and started to experience coral bleaching. HEPCA, the Environmental Association, was formed by the diving community in 1992 to protect the reefs. These coral reefs are the rainforests of the marine environment, Drewby explained. There are 800 species of coral reefs here and 1,200 species of fish. It although requires a healthy ecosystem, starting with the apex predator, the sharks. If too many sharks are killed, too many of the mid-level predators survive, and then they eat too many of the smaller plant-eating fish that keep coral healthy by eating the algae off substrates to clear space for the coral to colonize. A reef rich in herbivores will be more resilient. But for a long time, the local government and fishermen were not interested in the Red Sea having that kind of control. So HEPCA helped them understand the problem by putting it in their vernacular. They estimated that every shark in the Red Sea was worth about $150,000 a year in business from tourists flying there, airplane tickets, bus tickets, car tickets, and hotel rooms. And the average shark lived for 30 years. While a dead shark, killed for meat and fins for soup, brought in $150 one time. So if everyone worked together, if the government passed new zoning laws where people could fish and dive to or operators respected them, and HEPCA was empowered to enforce these regulations with its own speedboats, the Egyptian Coast Guard had no boats, everyone would be better off. Sounds simple, but it was a revolution there, and they pulled it off. I have no illusions, and neither did Drewby and his colleagues, about how hard it would be to bring this kind of shared commons thinking to the national level of Egyptian politics. But the absence of it is what ails all of these Arab awakening movements today, where one group or another thinks it can have it all, and too few people are thinking about the common good and how it has the potential to make them all better off. Syria is the most extreme version of this, but Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen are all struggling with the same issue, an issue that environmentalists start with. Where is the commons, and how do we protect it? Everyone has to take responsibility for the commons rather than just grabbing their own. That's the real cultural revolution that has to happen in Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and Syria if they're going to revive. And that's where environmentalists in the Middle East have such an advantage over the politicians, because all environmentalists there think about is the commons, resources that have to be shared. But what ideology should Arabs turn to? Well, if you talk to young Arabs today, they will tell you they've actually tried everything. Nasserism, socialism, communism, Baathism, liberalism, and Islamism. But nothing's worked. They are wrong. There is one ism they haven't tried: environmentalism. The only way Egypt and other Arab awakening states will have sustainable democracies with sustainable economies is to elevate environmentalism to the center of their political thinking, to make the commons the center of their politics. After all, there is no Sunni air or Shiite water or Kurdish topsoil. Without more commons thinking, either they will all destroy each other or Mother Nature will destroy them all. It's only a question of which happens first. When I think about the fix that America is in today, let me just say this in conclusion. Whether we're talking economically or environmentally, two images come to my mind. The first is a cartoon that ran in the New Yorker in the winter of 2011. It showed an elderly man meeting with his banker. And the caption underneath had the man saying, "I want to take out one of those mortgages on my grandchildren's future." That little cartoon summed up not only how we have behaved in the past, but how much damage we can still do. to the future if we don't change course and bring sustainable values to both the market and Mother Nature. We have literally been mortgaging our children's future by simultaneously consuming so many natural resources faster than their replacement rate and consuming so many financial resources without replacing them at all. We need to change course quickly, which brings up the other image. It is the famous scene in Orson Welles' 1958 film, Touch of Evil, about murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and corruption in a town on the Mexican-American border. Welles plays a crooked cop who tries to frame his Mexican counterpart for a murder. At one point, Welles stumbles into a brothel and finds the proprietor, Marlene Dietrich, who is also a fortune teller, with cards spread out in front of her. "Read my future for me," Welles says. "You haven't got any," she replies. "Your future is all used up." Is that us? Will that be our fate? Our future does not have to be all used up, either economically or environmentally, provided we fix what needs fixing today, right now, and get ourselves on a more sustainable growth path in both the market and Mother Nature. You see, our parents' generation, they were quite remarkable. They won the Cold War. They built us an incredible world of freedom. Freedom was really at the centerpiece of their national mission. For our generation, a different word has to be at the centerpiece, and that is sustainability. Because we are up against two giant forces, the market and Mother Nature at the same time. And as my teacher, Rob Watson, the man who invented green buildings, said to me once, "You know, Tom, Mother Nature, she's just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up, you can't talk her down, you can't say, 'Mother Nature, we've been having a tough recession. Could we take a year off?' No, she's going to do whatever she's going to do." And Mother Nature, said Rob, God bless her, she always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. Do not mess with Mother Nature. The market, Father Greed, he's just the balance between fear and greed, fear and greed, fear and greed, fear and greed at any millisecond around a stock, a bond, a commodity, a piece of real estate. Father Greed, he's going to do whatever that balance between fear and greed dictate at any moment. You can't talk him up, you can't talk him down. There's only one way you can manage two giant forces like that, and that is with sustainable values. Only by bringing sustainable values to both the market and Mother Nature will we be actually free. Because if we don't bring sustainable values to the market and Mother Nature, they will ultimately impose constraints on us, worse than had the Soviet Union won the Cold War. That is why what freedom was for our parents' generation, sustainability has to be for our generation. That is our mission. We need to get on with it. There is no time to waste, because there's one word that is rapidly disappearing from the English language, and that is later. Whatever you're going to save, please save it now, because later will be too late. Thank you very much. Thank you.